December 18th, 1944. The snow-covered forests of the Ardennes region lay silent under a pale winter moon, their beauty masking the chaos about to unfold. In a makeshift aid station near the Belgian town of Bastogne, Corporal James Whittaker of the 320th Medical Battalion carefully organized his supplies by candlelight, unaware that within hours, everything he thought he knew about battlefield medicine would be tested beyond imagination. The other medics had dismissed his unconventional approach to plasma administration as reckless, even dangerous. They preferred the textbook methods, the safe procedures taught in training camps far from the reality of war. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you are watching from. It really helps support the channel. What none of them understood yet was that James Whittaker's so-called crazy trick would transform battlefield medicine forever, and that a single night of unimaginable carnage would prove that sometimes survival depends not on following the rules, but on having the courage to rewrite them entirely. James had grown up in Birmingham, Alabama, where his father worked as a porter at the railway station and his mother cleaned houses for white families who never learned her first name. The neighborhood where the Whittaker family lived was a close-knit community of working-class black families who supported each other through the hardships imposed by segregation. From childhood, James had watched people in his community suffer from treatable conditions simply because the nearest hospital that would accept them was 30 miles away over poorly maintained roads. His older sister, Sarah, had nearly died from appendicitis when James was just 12 years old because the ambulance service refused to transport her to the White Hospital just 4 blocks from their home. James had held her hand as she screamed in pain, had felt her skin burning with fever, had watched his father plead with hospital administrators who remained unmoved by their desperation. Sarah had survived only because a black doctor from the distant hospital had driven through the night to perform emergency surgery on their kitchen table, using whatever instruments and supplies he could gather. That experience, the terror, the injustice, the recognition that medical knowledge could mean the difference between life and death, had planted a seed in young James that would eventually blossom into an unshakable determination to save lives, regardless of the obstacles placed in his path. He had decided that night, as he cleaned his sister's blood from the kitchen floor, that he would become a doctor and that he would never turn away anyone who needed help. When the conflict began, James had been studying pre-medicine at Tuskegee Institute, one of the few institutions where a young black man could pursue his dreams of becoming a doctor. The institute, founded by Booker T. Washington decades earlier, had become a beacon of educational opportunity for African Americans throughout the South. James had excelled in his studies, particularly in anatomy and physiology, earning the respect of his professors who recognized in him the dedication and intelligence necessary for medical practice. He had worked multiple jobs to pay his tuition, cleaning laboratories, tutoring other students, working weekends at a local funeral home where he learned about human anatomy in ways his textbooks could not teach. His academic achievements had earned him a partial scholarship, but the financial burden remained heavy, and he knew his family was making sacrifices to keep him in school. When the attack on Pearl Harbor came in December 1941, James had been torn between his educational dreams and his sense of duty. His father had fought in the first global conflict, serving in a segregated labor battalion in France, and had instilled in James a belief that citizenship required service even when that citizenship was incomplete and compromised by discrimination. James had volunteered for military service in 1942, hoping to serve in a medical capacity where his education and abilities could be put to meaningful use. He had been idealistic enough to believe that the military might be different from civilian society, that competence and dedication might matter more than the color of his skin. He learned quickly that the military was not different at all. That segregation was as rigid in uniform as it had been in civilian life. The armed forces of that era maintained strict racial separation, with black soldiers assigned to segregated units and typically relegated to service and labor battalions, loading supplies, building roads, performing the unglamorous but essential support work that kept armies functioning. Combat positions and advanced technical training were reserved primarily for white servicemen, based on racist assumptions about intelligence and capability that had no basis in fact, but were nonetheless embedded in military policy and practice. Yet James had persisted through basic training and medical training, demonstrating such exceptional aptitude that even his skeptical instructors could not deny his talent or justify holding him back. He scored at the top of his medical training class on every examination, practical and written. He could identify symptoms, diagnose conditions, and perform procedures with a precision that impressed even those who wanted to believe he was inherently inferior. Slowly, grudgingly, some of his instructors began to see him as an individual, rather than as a representative of a race they had been taught to view as less capable. He had been assigned to the 320th Medical Battalion, a segregated unit attached to the larger forces operating in the European theatre, and had shipped out to England in the spring of 1944 with a mixture of hope and trepidation about what service overseas might hold. Captain Robert Morrison, the battalion's commanding medical officer, had noticed James immediately during their deployment to England in the spring of 1944. Morrison was a Boston surgeon who had left a prestigious practice to serve, and he recognized in James a natural gift that transcended the artificial barriers of the era. Morrison began mentoring James unofficially, teaching him advanced techniques during quiet moments, sharing medical journals, and encouraging him to think beyond the standard protocols. It was Morrison who first introduced James to the emerging field of blood plasma therapy. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of requiring whole blood transfusions, which needed careful typing and matching, dried plasma could be reconstituted with sterile water and administered to patients regardless of blood type. Dr. Charles Drew, a black surgeon and researcher, had pioneered the process of separating and preserving blood plasma, and his work had established the blood bank systems that were now saving countless lives. The irony was not lost on James that Dr. Drew's innovations were helping soldiers of all backgrounds, even as the military blood supply remained segregated, with separate designations for donations from black and white donors. James had studied everything he could find about plasma therapy, reading Morrison's medical journals by flashlight long after his duties were complete. He learned that plasma could restore blood volume and prevent shock, buying precious time for wounded soldiers until they could receive definitive surgical care. But the standard protocols were conservative, almost timid. The training manuals recommended slow, careful administration, with frequent stops to monitor the patient's response. James understood the caution. Introducing foreign substances into a wounded body carried risks, but his mathematical mind kept calculating the terrible arithmetic of battlefield medicine. With limited supplies and overwhelming casualties, conservative administration meant some soldiers would die waiting for treatment that came too slowly. During the summer advance through France, James had begun experimenting with modified administration techniques during quiet periods. He had observed that when plasma was warmed to body temperature before administration, patients tolerated faster infusion rates without adverse reactions. He had also noticed that combining plasma with careful attention to patient positioning, elevating legs, maintaining warmth, produced better outcomes than plasma alone. These observations were not radical breakthroughs, but refinements that could shave precious minutes off treatment times. In battlefield medicine, minutes were not just time, they were lives. The other medics in his unit had mixed reactions to James's approach. Some, like Sergeant Thomas O'Brien from Chicago, respected his dedication and watched his techniques with interest. O'Brien had been a stockyard worker before the conflict, a tough Irish American who judged men by their competence rather than their skin color. He had seen James work under fire during the liberation of several French villages, had watched him treat wounded soldiers with a combination of skill and compassion that inspired confidence even in the most desperate circumstances. But others were less accepting. Private First Class Dale Henderson, a farm boy from Mississippi, made no secret of his belief that black soldiers had no business anywhere near frontline medical care. Henderson had grown up in a world where racial hierarchies were enforced with violence, and the military's decision to deploy integrated medical units, even if the units themselves remained segregated, offended his sense of natural order. He referred to James's plasma techniques as voodoo medicine, and he encouraged other medics to stick with the proven textbook methods. Staff Sergeant Paul Kowalski, the senior enlisted medic, tried to maintain peace within the unit while remaining committed to standard procedures. Kowalski was a career soldier from Pennsylvania coal country, a man who believed that military regulations existed for good reasons and that deviation from established protocols invited disaster. He had seen too many well-intentioned innovations fail under the pressure of combat. When Morrison had departed in late November to attend a medical conference in London, Kowalski had explicitly instructed the medics to follow standard plasma administration guidelines. He had looked directly at James when giving that order, making his meaning clear. The tension within the unit was a microcosm of the broader American military's struggle with integration during the conflict. President Truman would not order the full integration of the armed forces until 1948, 3 years after the war's end, but the desperate manpower needs of combat were already forcing some informal integration in frontline positions. Black soldiers were proving themselves in combat roles, challenging the racist assumptions that had kept them in support positions. Yet progress was grudging, and black servicemen like James often found themselves having to prove their competence repeatedly, knowing that any mistake would be seen not as an individual failing, but as evidence of racial inferiority. By December, the Allied forces had advanced deep into the European continent, and there was widespread optimism that the conflict might end before the new year. The German forces appeared to be in full retreat, their industrial capacity shattered by years of aerial bombardment, their armies depleted by years of combat on multiple fronts. Intelligence reports suggested that the German military of that era lacked the resources for any major offensive operations. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. In the early morning hours of December 16, 1944, the German armed forces during the conflict launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, the same route they had used to invade France in 1940. The operation involved more than 200,000 soldiers, hundreds of armored vehicles, and extensive artillery support. The goal was to split the Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace that would allow the German regime to consolidate its remaining territorial holdings. The offensive caught Allied forces completely by surprise. Entire units were surrounded, supply lines were cut, and communications broke down as German units penetrated deep into Allied-held territory. The weather was terrible: heavy snow, thick fog, and freezing temperatures that grounded Allied aircraft and gave the German forces freedom of movement. Within hours, the careful order of the Allied advance had collapsed into chaos. The 320th Medical Battalion was positioned near Bastogne, a critical road junction that quickly became the focal point of the offensive. As German units surrounded the town, thousands of American soldiers found themselves trapped, fighting desperately to hold the perimeter against overwhelming force. The Medical Battalion's aid station, set up in a partially destroyed barn on the outskirts of town, was suddenly at the center of a humanitarian catastrophe. James was organizing supplies when the first casualties began arriving on the evening of December 17th. A handful of wounded soldiers, carried by their comrades or limping on their own, men with wounds from artillery fragments and small arms fire. The numbers were manageable, and James and his fellow medics treated them efficiently using standard protocols. They administered plasma to those in shock, applied dressings, administered pain medication, and prepared the seriously wounded for evacuation to rear-area hospitals. But evacuation was becoming impossible. The roads were cut. The German forces controlled most of the surrounding countryside. By nightfall on December 17th, it became clear that they were trapped. The medical supplies they had expected to last for weeks would have to sustain them for an unknown duration, treating an unknown number of casualties with no possibility of resupply. Staff Sergeant Kowalski gathered the medics that evening. They were 9 men total: Kowalski, James, O'Brien, Henderson, and 5 others whose skills ranged from competent to barely adequate. They had medical supplies sufficient for perhaps 50 serious casualties under normal circumstances. They had 32 units of dried plasma, each unit sufficient for 1 patient if administered according to standard protocols. They had morphine, sulfur drugs, bandages, and surgical instruments. They had a single surgical tent with inadequate heating and lighting. They had a basement in the barn that could serve as a sheltered ward for the seriously wounded. What they did not have Was any realistic hope of evacuation or resupply in the near future? The situation outside was deteriorating by the hour. Artillery fire echoed constantly in the distance, punctuated by the distinctive sound of heavy vehicle engines and small arms fire. Radio communications were sporadic, but the fragments of information they received painted a grim picture. The forces defending Bastogne were outnumbered at least 4-1. Ammunition was running low. Food was scarce. Medical supplies were critically short across all units. Kowalski laid out the reality with brutal clarity. They would need to triage aggressively, focusing resources on those with the best chance of survival. They would need to conserve plasma and other critical supplies. They would need to prepare for the possibility that many wounded soldiers would not receive the treatment they needed. It was a speech no medical professional ever wants to give, an acknowledgement that they would be forced to make terrible choices about who lived and who died, based not on medical need but on resource scarcity. James listened to Kowalski's instructions with growing unease. He understood the logic. With limited supplies and unlimited need, conservation made sense. But his mind kept returning to the plasma protocols. 32 units, administered slowly according to standard procedures, might treat 32 patients over the course of many hours. But if they modified the protocols, if they used his techniques, they could potentially treat more patients more quickly, maximizing the impact of their limited supplies. He voiced his thoughts carefully that night, suggesting that they consider modified plasma administration procedures to stretch their supplies. Kowalski cut him off immediately. This was not the time for experimentation, Kowalski said firmly. They would follow established medical protocols precisely. Deviation would be considered a violation of orders. Kowalski's tone made clear that this was not open for discussion. Henderson smirked at James from across the room, his expression making his thoughts obvious. This was not a moment for the black medic's crazy ideas. This was a moment for proven methods, for discipline, for trusting the wisdom of the medical establishment. Several other medics nodded in agreement with Kowalski's position. Only O'Brien caught James's eye and gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug that seemed to say, "I hear you, but this is not a fight you can win right now. Wait. Your moment will come." James said nothing more. He returned to his preparations, checking and rechecking supplies, reviewing his mental notes on plasma therapy, and praying that O'Brien was right, that there would be a moment when his knowledge could make a difference. The moment came sooner than anyone expected, and it arrived with a violence that defied imagination. December 18th began with scattered casualties. A dozen wounded soldiers brought in during the morning hours, men with various injuries that the medics treated methodically. The aid station developed a rhythm: receive casualties, assess injuries, provide immediate treatment, move the stabilized wounded to the basement ward, prepare for the next group. By afternoon, they had treated 23 wounded soldiers and had used 11 units of plasma. Resources were depleting faster than ideal, but the situation remained manageable. Then the late afternoon artillery barrage began. The German forces launched a concentrated assault on the southeastern perimeter of the Bastogne defensive area, a massive push designed to break through the Allied lines and capture the town. The bombardment was unlike anything the medics had experienced before. Sustained, heavy fire that went on for hours, saturating defensive positions with high explosive and shrapnel. The sound was overwhelming, a constant rolling thunder that made the ground shake and the walls of the barn tremble. When the infantry assault followed the barrage, the American soldiers holding the perimeter fought with desperate courage. They held their positions against waves of attackers, but the cost was terrible. As darkness fell on December 18th, the casualties began arriving at the aid station, in numbers that turned order into chaos. They came in trucks, on stretchers, walking with support from their comrades, carried on makeshift litters. They came with wounds from artillery fragments, from small arms fire, from close combat. They came bleeding, in shock, crying out in pain or silent in the grey stupor that precedes death. They came in a flood that overwhelmed the aid station's capacity within the first hour. By 7 o'clock that evening, more than 60 wounded soldiers were crowded into and around the barn. The single surgical tent was full. The basement ward was full. Wounded men lay in the snow outside. covered with whatever blankets and tarps the medics could find. The temperature was dropping below freezing, snow was falling heavily, and the casualties kept coming. Kowalski and the other medics worked with frantic efficiency, moving from patient to patient, making rapid triage decisions, administering what treatment they could. But the mathematics of disaster were inescapable. They had already used 23 units of plasma. They had 9 units remaining. They had more than 60 patients, with at least 30 in serious shock, who desperately needed plasma to survive. James worked alongside the others, his hands moving with practiced precision even as his mind raced through calculations. 9 units of plasma, administered according to standard protocols, would take approximately 45 minutes each, including preparation and monitoring. 9 patients treated over 6 to 7 hours. Meanwhile, 20 or more patients in critical shock would die waiting for treatment that would never come. The scene in the aid station was beyond description. Wounded soldiers lay everywhere, their blood staining the straw-covered floor, their cries filling the air. The medics moved through the chaos like men in a nightmare, doing what they could, knowing it was hopelessly insufficient. Henderson was in the surgical tent, assisting with an amputation. O'Brien was in the basement, organizing the ward. Kowalski was at the triage point, making the terrible decisions about who would receive limited resources. James found himself in the main barn area, with 3 of the less experienced medics, treating a group of soldiers in severe shock. These were men whose injuries were survivable if they received prompt treatment, men who would die within hours without plasma to restore their blood volume and stabilize their systems. There were 8 such patients in James's immediate area, with more in similar condition throughout the aid station. One of the medics, a young private named Robert Chen, who had been a pharmacy student before the conflict, was preparing to administer plasma to the first patient. Chen was following the standard protocol, carefully warming the plasma powder, slowly mixing it with sterile water, setting up the administration line, preparing to deliver the fluid slowly over 45 minutes while monitoring the patient's vital signs. James watched Chen work and felt something crystallize in his mind. The standard protocol would save 1 patient over the next hour. His modified technique might save 3 or 4 in the same time period. The choice was not between safe and risky. The choice was between following orders and multiplying their capacity to save lives. He made his decision. James approached Chen and spoke quietly, his voice calm despite the chaos around them. He told Chen that he knew a modified technique that could allow them to treat more patients with their limited plasma supply. He explained the principle, warming the plasma more carefully to body temperature, using faster administration rates that shocked patients could safely tolerate, combining plasma therapy with aggressive patient warming and positioning to maximize effectiveness. He explained that he had used these techniques before with good results, and that in their current situation, treating 3 patients imperfectly was better than treating 1 patient perfectly. Chen listened, his young face reflecting uncertainty. He had been taught to follow protocols, to trust the established procedures, but he could also see the wounded soldiers dying around them, could understand the brutal mathematics of their situation. He looked at James, at this black corporal who spoke with such quiet confidence, and made his own decision. He nodded. "Show me," Chen said simply. James moved quickly. He selected 3 patients whose condition and injuries suggested they would respond well to aggressive plasma therapy. He prepared 3 plasma units simultaneously, using a technique he had developed where the warming process could be carefully managed in stages. He set up 3 administration lines. He positioned the patients to maximize blood flow to vital organs. He had Chen and the other 2 medics assist him, turning the standard 1 medic 1 patient protocol into a coordinated team effort. Then he began the infusions, monitoring all 3 patients simultaneously with an attention to detail that bordered on superhuman. His eyes moved constantly between the 3 men, watching for any sign of adverse reaction, adjusting flow rates, maintaining optimal patient positioning. His hands moved with absolute precision, making minor adjustments to equipment, checking pulses, assessing skin temperature and color. The other medics in the barn noticed what James was doing. Henderson, returning from the surgical tent, saw 3 patients receiving plasma simultaneously and moved toward James with anger clear on his face. This was a direct violation of Kowalski's orders, a reckless deviation from standard protocols that endangered patients and undermined unit discipline. But before Henderson could intervene, something remarkable happened. All three patients began showing signs of improvement. Their pulses strengthened, their skin color improved. The gray pallor of shock began to fade. Within 20 minutes, all three men were noticeably more stable. Within 35 minutes, they were sufficiently recovered to move to the basement ward, freeing up space and resources for the next wave of casualties. O'Brien had come up from the basement just in time to witness the last phase of James's treatment. He saw three soldiers, who had been at death's door now, alert enough to speak, asking for water, asking about their units, displaying the kind of cognitive function that indicated their brains were once again receiving adequate blood flow. He saw James already preparing to treat the next group of patients using the same technique. O'Brien made a calculation of his own. He had been a Union steward in the stockyards before the conflict, a man accustomed to making difficult decisions in crisis situations. He could see that James's technique worked. He could also see that they had at least 30 more patients in critical shock and only 6 units of plasma remaining. Following standard protocols meant choosing which 6 patients lived and accepting that the rest would die. Using James's technique meant they might save 15 or 18 patients, possibly more. O'Brien stepped between Henderson and James. He told Henderson to go help in the surgical tent. They needed someone with experience to assist with another emergency procedure. Henderson hesitated, clearly torn between his desire to stop James and his sense of duty. O'Brien's voice hardened. "That was not a suggestion," O'Brien said. "It was an order." Henderson left, shooting one last venomous look at James. Then O'Brien turned to James. "I will handle Kowalski," O'Brien said quietly. "You focus on keeping these men alive. Show me what you need, and I will help coordinate the other medics. We will run this as an assembly line. You are the line supervisor. Chen, Murphy, and Davidson will assist you. I will manage the flow of patients and supplies. We will treat every soldier in this barn who needs plasma, and we will do it before dawn. Understood?" James understood. For the first time since the casualties had begun flooding in, he felt a surge of hope. With O'Brien's support and coordination, with adequate assistance, they could do this. They could save dozens of lives that would otherwise be lost to resource scarcity and conservative protocols. What followed over the next 7 hours was one of the most remarkable performances of battlefield medicine in the history of the conflict. James and his small team established a rhythm that was part medical procedure, part industrial process, and part improvised jazz. They organized patients into groups based on the severity of their shock and the nature of their injuries. They prepared plasma units in batches, carefully managing the warming and mixing process. They administered treatment to multiple patients simultaneously, with James serving as the central coordinator, monitoring all patients continuously, making constant adjustments to optimize outcomes. The technique was intense and demanding. James had to maintain absolute focus on multiple patients at once, watching for the subtle signs that might indicate a problem. Changes in pulse, alterations in breathing pattern, shifts in skin color or temperature. He had to make instantaneous decisions about flow rates and patient positioning. He had to trust his assistants while remaining the final authority on all treatment decisions. Chen proved to be an exceptionally quick learner, absorbing James's techniques and soon able to manage 2 patients independently while James coordinated the overall operation. Murphy, a former factory worker from Detroit, brought an industrial mindset to the work, organizing supplies and workspace with an efficiency that maximized throughput. Davidson, the quietest of the group, became the detail manager, ensuring that every step was completed correctly, that nothing was overlooked in the rush. O'Brien was true to his word, managing the flow of patients and running interference with Kowalski and the others. When Kowalski came to investigate the unusually rapid patient turnover, O'Brien met him at the barn entrance and walked him through the mathematics. James and his team had treated 12 critical patients in the time it would have taken to treat 3 using standard protocols. All 12 patients had survived and were now stable enough for the basement ward. They still had dozens more critical patients waiting. The modified technique was working. Kowalski stood in the barn entrance watching James work with an expression that combined concern, calculation, and growing realization. He was watching protocols being violated, but he was also watching lives being saved. He was watching a black corporal demonstrate a level of medical skill that challenged every assumption Kowalski had made about racial hierarchies and military order. He was watching the impossible become possible because one man had the courage to trust his knowledge and the skill to execute his vision. Kowalski made his decision. He told O'Brien that he would take responsibility for the protocol deviation. If there were adverse outcomes, if patients died because of the modified technique, Kowalski would accept full blame. But for now, James would continue. They would save everyone they could save, using whatever methods worked. Kowalski returned to his coordination duties, and the modified plasma operation continued. Through the night, the team worked without rest. They treated patients in groups of 3 or 4, moving through the critical cases with relentless efficiency. James's stamina was extraordinary. He maintained his intense focus for hour after hour, his attention never wavering, his hands never faltering. When other medics needed breaks, James continued, sustained by something deeper than physical endurance. He was doing what he had always been meant to do, using his gifts to save lives without regard for the barriers that society had tried to impose on him. The scene in the barn gradually transformed. The chaos began to organize into order. The cries of pain diminished as more patients received treatment and pain medication. The grey pallor of shock faded from face after face as plasma restored blood volume and vital organ function. The pile of bodies that everyone had feared would grow in one corner of the barn never materialized. Instead, the basement ward filled with stabilized patients, men who would survive, who would eventually return to their families, who owed their lives to a black medic's crazy plasma trick. By 3 o'clock in the morning on December 19th, James and his team had treated 47 critical patients using the 6 remaining plasma units, plus the 5 units they had been able to stretch by using every drop of available reconstitution fluid. They had achieved what should have been impossible, treating more than 4 times as many patients as their plasma supplies should have allowed. But they were not finished. As the night continued, more casualties arrived, though the flow had slowed somewhat as the German assault paused to consolidate gains. James continued working, now using modified techniques that did not require plasma, aggressive patient warming, careful positioning, fluid management using available intravenous solutions. He trained other medics in these techniques, spreading the knowledge, multiplying the capacity of the entire aid station. By dawn on December 19th, the medical team had treated and stabilized more than 80 seriously wounded soldiers. The basement ward was packed with survivors who should have died, but lived because one medic had dared to innovate under impossible circumstances. The mortality rate in James's treatment area was less than 8%, compared to the expected rate of 50% or higher for patients in severe shock without adequate plasma supplies. As the winter sun rose over Bastonia, casting pale light through the barn's damaged roof, James finally allowed himself to rest. He sat on a straw bale in the corner of the barn, his uniform stained with blood, his hands trembling with exhaustion, his mind still processing the events of the night. O'Brien brought him coffee, real coffee somehow procured from a supply sergeant who owed him a favor. They sat together in silence for a moment, watching the other medics moving through the ward, checking on patients, changing dressings, administering medications. O'Brien spoke first. "What you did tonight," O'Brien said quietly, "that was the finest piece of medical work I have ever witnessed. You saved at least 40 men who would have died, probably more. You took techniques that existed in theory and made them work in the worst possible conditions. You proved that innovation and courage matter more than protocols when lives are on the line." James sipped his coffee and considered his response. He wanted to say that he had only done what needed to be done, that any competent medic would have done the same. But he knew that was not true. What he had done required not just skill, but a willingness to challenge authority, to risk censure and punishment, to trust his own judgment against the weight of established practice. It required the kind of courage that comes from a lifetime of having to prove yourself in a world that constantly doubts your worth. Before James could respond, Kowalski approached. The staff sergeant looked exhausted, aged by the night's events. He stood before James and O'Brien, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion and fatigue. "Corporal Whitaker," Kowalski said formally, "I need to speak with you about last night's protocol deviations." James felt his stomach tighten, preparing for the reprimand he knew must be coming. But Kowalski continued in a different direction. "I need to speak with you about how we are going to implement your techniques as standard procedure for this aid station going forward. I need you to train every medic in this unit on your modified plasma administration protocols. I need you to document your methods so that when Captain Morrison returns, we can recommend these techniques for adoption across the entire medical battalion." Kowalski paused, struggling with something. Then he continued, "I also need to apologize to you, Corporal. I let my adherence to regulations and my own limited imagination prevent me from seeing the value in your ideas. I allowed my assumptions about who could innovate and who should lead to nearly cost us dozens of lives. You were right, and I was wrong. Your techniques worked, and they will save countless more lives in the days ahead. Thank you for having the courage to do what was necessary despite my orders to the contrary." James was stunned into silence. In his entire military career, he had never heard a white, non-commissioned officer apologize to a black soldier, never heard anyone in authority acknowledge that racial prejudice had clouded their judgment. He managed to respond that he appreciated Kowalski's words, that they had all been doing their best under impossible circumstances, that the only thing that mattered was that they had saved lives together. Over the following days, as the forces in Bastogne continued to hold out against overwhelming odds, the aid station became known for its remarkably high survival rate among seriously wounded patients. Word spread among the trapped units that if you could make it to the 320 Medical Battalion's aid station, you would survive. The medics there had somehow figured out how to stretch limited supplies and save soldiers that other aid stations would have given up on. James trained every medic in the unit on his modified techniques. He found that most learned quickly when they saw the results. Even Henderson, after witnessing a soldier from his home state of Mississippi saved by James's plasma protocol, grudgingly admitted that the techniques were effective. Henderson never became friendly with James, but he stopped referring to his methods as voodoo medicine and started using the modified protocols himself. Captain Morrison returned to the unit on December 22nd, fighting his way through German lines with a supply convoy. He was astonished to find the aid station still operational and shocked to learn about the events of December 18th and 19th. Morrison immediately recognized the significance of what James had accomplished. He spent hours debriefing James, taking detailed notes on the modified techniques and examining patient outcomes. Morrison submitted a formal report to the battalion's commanding officer, recommending that James's plasma administration protocols be adopted throughout the medical corps. He also recommended that James receive a commendation for his actions under fire. The report emphasized that James had demonstrated the kind of innovative thinking and courageous action that exemplified the highest ideals of military medicine. The recommendations faced resistance as they moved up the chain of command. Some officers questioned whether a black enlisted man could have truly developed medical techniques worthy of widespread adoption. Others worried about the political implications of officially recognizing that protocol deviations had saved lives, fearing it might undermine overall military discipline. But Morrison was persistent, and the results were undeniable. The modified techniques were quietly adopted by many medical units in the European theater, though James's name was often omitted from the official descriptions. James himself continued serving with distinction through the remainder of the conflict. He participated in the relief of Bastogne when the forces finally broke through the encirclement after Christmas. He served in the advance into the German homeland in early 1945. He was present when the conflict in Europe finally ended in May of that year. Through it all, he continued refining his techniques, training other medics and saving lives with a combination of skill, innovation, and compassion that transcended the racial barriers of his era. After the conflict ended, James returned to the United States and completed his medical education using the benefits provided to veterans under the legislation that helped millions of returning servicemen access higher education and vocational training. He returned to Tuskegee Institute to finish his undergraduate degree, then attended Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, one of the historically black medical schools that trained the majority of African American physicians during the era of segregation. The years of medical school were challenging, not just academically, but financially and emotionally. James worked nights as an orderly at the local black hospital to support himself, often studying his textbooks during quiet moments on his shifts. He watched patients suffer and sometimes die from conditions that could have been treated at the better-equipped white hospitals across town, hospitals that would not admit black patients regardless of the severity of their conditions. The injustice fueled his determination to become the best physician he could be, to provide his community with the quality of care that society tried to deny them. He graduated at the top of his medical school class in 1950, earning his medical degree with honors and receiving offers from several hospitals and clinics seeking talented physicians. He could have pursued opportunities in the North, where segregation was less rigid, and where black physicians could sometimes gain privileges at integrated hospitals. Instead, he chose to return to Birmingham, to the community that had raised him, to the people who most needed his skills. He became a doctor, as he had always dreamed, though he still faced discrimination in a country that remained deeply segregated nearly 5 years after a conflict ostensibly fought for freedom and democracy. He opened a practice in a modest building on the edge of the black business district, serving the African-American community that had been his family's world. His office waiting room was always full, patients arriving early in the morning, and sometimes waiting hours for treatment because they trusted Dr. Whitaker, because they knew he would take time to listen to their concerns, because his fees were modest and he never turned away anyone who could not pay. He treated everything from childhood illnesses to chronic conditions, delivered babies, provided prenatal care, performed minor surgical procedures, and served as both physician and counselor to families facing health crises. He became known for his diagnostic skills and his willingness to make house calls at any hour. Driving through Birmingham's segregated neighborhoods in his used sedan, his medical bag always ready on the passenger seat. James married his childhood sweetheart, Grace, and they raised 3 children who all pursued careers in medicine or public service. He became a respected figure in Birmingham's civil rights movement, using his status as a war veteran and physician to advocate for integration and equal treatment. He spoke occasionally about his wartime experiences, though he downplayed his own role, always emphasizing the collaborative nature of battlefield medicine and the courage of the wounded soldiers he had treated. In 1953, nearly a decade after the events in Bastogne, James received an unexpected visitor at his Birmingham office. Thomas O'Brien, his former sergeant, had traveled from Chicago specifically to see him. O'Brien was there to inform James that a group of the soldiers saved during that terrible night in December 1944 had been searching for him. They wanted to honor him, to thank him publicly for saving their lives. What resulted was a reunion in 1954 that brought together more than 30 of the survivors from the 320 Medical Battalion's aid station. These men, white and black, from across the country, gathered to honor the medic whose crazy plasma trick had given them a future they otherwise would not have had. They raised money for a scholarship fund in James's name at Tuskegee Institute, ensuring that other young black students could pursue careers in medicine. The reunion received coverage in several newspapers, including some in the South where such integrated gatherings were still controversial. The articles helped spread awareness of James's wartime innovations and his contributions to battlefield medicine. Medical journals began publishing retrospective analyses of the modified plasma protocols that had emerged during the conflict. And while James was not always credited by name, those who knew the history understood his role. Captain Robert Morrison, who had become a prominent surgeon in Boston after the conflict, never stopped advocating for recognition of James's achievements. Morrison published several papers on battlefield plasma therapy that specifically credited James's techniques and described the events of December 18th and 19th, 1944 in detail. Morrison testified before medical boards and military committees, arguing that James's innovations had saved hundreds of lives beyond that single night, as other medics adopted and spread his techniques throughout the conflict's final months. The formal recognition James deserved came slowly, hindered by the racial politics of the era and by the military's institutional reluctance to acknowledge that life-saving innovations had emerged from protocol violations. It was not until 1968, after the civil rights movement had forced some reckoning with America's racial history, that James received an official commendation from the military for his service. Even then, the citation was carefully worded to avoid explicit acknowledgement that he had defied orders or that racial prejudice had initially prevented recognition of his achievements. But for James, the recognition that mattered most had come much earlier in the letters he received over the years from the men he had saved and from their families. Fathers thanked him for giving them more time with their sons. Wives thanked him for bringing their husbands home. Children thanked him for saving their fathers, allowing them to grow up with the parent they might never have known. These letters filled a box in James's office, a tangible reminder of why he had become a doctor, why he had risked his career to trust his own knowledge during that desperate night in Bastogne. James Whittaker practiced medicine in Birmingham for more than 4 decades. He trained younger doctors, mentored aspiring medical students, and continued innovating throughout his career. He participated in the integration of Birmingham's hospitals in the 1960s, using his status as a respected physician and war veteran to challenge the segregated medical system. He saw the hospital where his sister had been turned away finally begin accepting black patients without restrictions. When James passed away in 1989 at the age of 69, his funeral in Birmingham drew hundreds of mourners. Among them were several elderly white men who had traveled from across the country. The last surviving members of that group, saved in December 1944, men who had lived full lives because a black medic had dared to innovate when innovation was their only hope for survival. They stood at his graveside and told stories of that terrible night, of the young corporal who had worked without rest, who had proven that courage and skill matter more than the color of one's skin, who had embodied the highest ideals of medicine by refusing to accept that anyone should die when he had the knowledge to save them. The story of James Whittaker and the plasma protocols of Bastogne entered medical history as one of the great examples of battlefield innovation under pressure. His techniques, refined and standardized after the conflict, became foundational to modern emergency medicine's approach to treating shock and maintaining blood volume in trauma patients. The principles he demonstrated, aggressive early intervention, efficient resource utilization, continuous monitoring, and willingness to adapt protocols to circumstances, are now taught in every emergency medicine program and military medical training course. But beyond the medical innovations, James's story represents something larger about the nature of prejudice, courage, and human potential. He lived in an era that tried to limit his opportunities based on race, that assumed black soldiers could not develop cutting-edge medical techniques, that would have been content to let wounded men die rather than acknowledge that a corporal might know better than established protocols. He overcame those barriers not through anger or confrontation, but through quiet competence, unshakable courage, and an absolute commitment to the value of every human life. The other medics who witnessed James's work that night in December 1944 carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. O'Brien told his children and grandchildren about the finest medic he ever served with, a man whose skill saved dozens of lives in a single night. Even Henderson, decades later, admitted to his son that he had been wrong about James Whittaker, that prejudice had nearly blinded him to witnessing something extraordinary. Kowalski included a description of James's plasma techniques in the memoir he wrote late in life, calling it the moment when he learned that true leadership means recognizing brilliance wherever it emerges, and having the humility to acknowledge when your assumptions have been proven wrong. Chen, the young medic who had been the first to trust James's modified protocols, became a pharmacist after the conflict and later a professor of pharmacology. He included the story of that night in Bastogne in every lecture series he taught on emergency medicine, using it to illustrate the importance of critical thinking, innovation under pressure, and the courage to question authority when lives are at stake. He corresponded with James for decades, and when Chen retired, he donated his papers to a medical history archive with a specific request that James's contributions to battlefield medicine be properly documented for future generations. The barn that served as the 320 Medical Battalion's aid station during the defense of Bastogne was destroyed in the final days of the conflict, but the site became part of the historical preservation of the battlefield. A small marker there, placed in the 1970s after years of advocacy by Morrison and others, acknowledges the medical personnel who served there and notes that innovative medical techniques developed under combat conditions saved more than 200 lives during the siege. The number 200 is significant. While James personally treated approximately 80 patients during the night of December 18th and 19th, the techniques he demonstrated that night were quickly adopted by other medics in the unit and in neighboring units. Over the remainder of the siege of Bastogne, which lasted until December 26th when relief forces broke through, those modified plasma protocols were used to treat hundreds of wounded soldiers. Morrison's careful documentation showed that the survival rate for patients in severe shock at aid stations using James's techniques was more than 40% higher than at stations using standard protocols. Over the course of the siege, that difference in survival rates translated to more than 200 additional soldiers who lived instead of died, 200 men who went home to their families, 200 futures that existed because one medic refused to accept that limited resources meant limited possibilities. 200 lives saved by innovation, courage, and a refusal to let prejudice determine who could contribute to solving impossible problems. The broader historical significance of James's story extends beyond the specific medical innovations. His experience reflected the complex reality of African American service during the conflict. Men who served their country with distinction despite facing discrimination and segregation, who proved their competence and courage repeatedly, who contributed to victory in ways that were often unrecognized or minimized. James was one of more than 1 million Black Americans who served in the military during the conflict, most in segregated units, many in support roles, but all playing essential parts in the eventual triumph over the German regime and its allies. The conflict marked a turning point in African American history as the contradiction between fighting for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home became increasingly untenable. Veterans like James returned to America, demanding the rights and respect they had earned, and their service became a powerful argument for civil rights. The eventual integration of the military in 1948 was a direct result of the exemplary service of Black soldiers during the conflict, and that military integration became a model and catalyst for the broader civil rights movement that transformed American society in the following decades. James's story also illustrates the broader transformation of military medicine during the conflict. The massive casualties and resource constraints of modern warfare drove rapid innovation in trauma care, blood therapy, surgical techniques, and medical logistics. The conflict produced more advances in battlefield medicine than any previous conflict in history, and many of those advances came from frontline medics and surgeons who had to innovate under pressure, who learned that survival often depended on abandoning peacetime protocols and adapting to the brutal realities of combat medicine. The plasma therapy techniques that James refined in Bastogne were part of a larger revolution in transfusion medicine that saved countless lives during the conflict and transformed civilian emergency medicine afterward. The blood bank systems developed during the conflict, the understanding of shock and resuscitation, the protocols for mass casualty management, all emerged from the terrible laboratory of combat and became standard practice in civilian hospitals and emergency rooms. Every person who has benefited from modern emergency medicine owes a debt to the medics and surgeons who innovated under fire, who proved that medical science could advance even in the worst circumstances when talented individuals were given the freedom to think creatively and act decisively. In the decades since the conflict, as medical historians have examined the development of modern trauma care, James Whitaker's contributions have received increasing recognition. His modified plasma protocols are now studied as a classic example of adaptive innovation, and his story is included in medical ethics courses as an illustration of the tension between following established procedures and exercising clinical judgment in extreme circumstances. The question he faced, whether to obey orders that would result in preventable deaths or to violate protocols in order to save lives, remains a powerful teaching tool for exploring the responsibilities of medical professionals in crisis situations. The personal qualities that James demonstrated during that December night in Bastogne, the ability to maintain focus under extreme stress, the courage to trust his own judgment against institutional authority, the physical stamina to work without rest, the compassion that drove him to exhaust himself saving strangers. These are the qualities that define the greatest practitioners of medicine in any era. His story reminds us that exceptional medical care requires not just technical knowledge, but also moral courage, creative thinking, and an unwavering commitment to the principle that every life has value and deserves the best care possible. For the soldiers who survived because of James's innovations, the experience shaped the rest of their lives in profound ways. Many became advocates for civil rights, having seen firsthand how a black medic's skill had saved their lives while society continued to treat black Americans as second-class citizens. Some maintained contact with James for decades, visiting him in Birmingham, supporting his medical practice, and helping fund the scholarship program established in his name. They understood that they owed him not just their lives, but also a debt to work toward the kind of society where talent and character mattered more than race, where artificial barriers did not prevent people from contributing their gifts to solving humanity's greatest challenges. The Christmas season of 1944, which should have been a time of hope, as the conflict appeared to be nearing its end, instead became one of the darkest moments of the European theatre. The surprise offensive through the Ardennes created a crisis that threatened to unravel months of progress and extend the conflict indefinitely. But amid that darkness, there were moments of remarkable light, ordinary people rising to extraordinary challenges, innovations emerging from desperate necessity, courage manifest in countless acts of selfless service. James Whittaker's story represents one of those moments of light. In a barn in Belgium, during one terrible night when death seemed inevitable for dozens of wounded soldiers, a young medic proved that human ingenuity and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. He showed that the measure of a person lies not in the color of their skin or the limits others try to impose, but in their willingness to use their gifts in service of others, to persist in the face of doubt and opposition, to believe that what seems impossible might be achievable if approached with skill, determination, and faith in human potential. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.